It was early May 1945. The war in Europe had just ended, but inside a small American-run prisoner-of-war camp on the outskirts of Würzburg, the air still carried the weight of fear and silence. The morning fog hung low over the wooden barracks, curling through the rusted barbed wire. Dozens of German women, former nurses, clerks, and auxiliary staff of the Wehrmacht, stood in line, their gray uniforms damp with dew, their faces pale and expressionless. For months they had been told to expect punishment, humiliation, or even execution. Then, a tall American officer stepped forward. His tone was calm, almost routine. Through an interpreter, he announced that beginning that morning they were allowed to walk freely inside the camp, unescorted, unrestricted, and unguarded within the perimeter. The words fell into the air like a foreign language. The women stared back, frozen. Some glanced toward the watchtower, expecting gunfire. Others simply looked down, waiting for the trick. But nothing came. The gates within the camp opened, and the guards stepped aside. For the first time since their capture, silence gave way to an uneasy sound. Footsteps moving without orders, hesitant and slow. Freedom, even a limited one, felt unreal. Yet that moment was only the beginning of something larger. By the spring of 1945, Germany was a collapsing nation. The Reich that once stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga was in ruins, its armies shattered, its cities reduced to smoldering rubble. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and millions of German soldiers were surrendering in waves across Europe. But among the surrendered were not only the exhausted remnants of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS. There were thousands of women, many young, many still in their 20s, who had served the Nazi state in administrative and auxiliary roles. They were typists, medics, radio operators, drivers, and nurses. For years they had lived within the strict discipline and ideology of the Third Reich. Now, suddenly, they were prisoners. When the American forces advanced through southern Germany, they encountered large numbers of these women among captured units or in retreating columns of refugees. Some were still in uniform, carrying medical satchels or Red Cross armbands. Others wore tattered civilian coats with insignia hastily removed. They were rounded up and transported to makeshift collection points, old Wehrmacht barracks, farms, or fenced-off fields, later formalized into prisoner-of-war camps under U.S. control. Many expected retribution. Nazi propaganda had painted Allied forces as vengeful monsters, particularly toward German women. The fear ran deep. Some believed they would be executed, others that they would be sent to forced labor camps in Siberia, unaware that they had fallen into American rather than Soviet hands. But the Americans, following both the Geneva Convention and their own moral philosophy, treated these prisoners very differently from what the women anticipated. By mid-1945, the United States Army had established hundreds of POW enclosures across Germany to process nearly 8 million captives. Within these camps, male and female prisoners were strictly separated, and female groups were often assigned to smaller, more controlled environments. Yet even within those parameters, the Americans implemented policies that reflected not revenge, but re-education and humane containment. Unlike the Eastern Front, where cruelty had become normalized, the Western Allies maintained administrative discipline and relative restraint. Food was limited but consistent. Medical care was provided through Army medics and captured German nurses, who were allowed to continue working under supervision. Sanitation facilities were crude, but far better than those experienced in Soviet captivity. The Americans sought not to degrade, but to demilitarize and observe. It was a deliberate contrast to Nazi brutality, a quiet assertion that moral order could be restored through dignity rather than dominance. In early May, when the war ended in Europe, the status of many of these German women became ambiguous. Some had been members of the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps, legally part of the military, and thus qualified as legitimate POWs under the Geneva Convention. Others were considered civilian internees, held temporarily for investigation due to their proximity to military operations. Many had served as communication clerks or nurses at field hospitals near the front, while some had volunteered in the Reich Labor Service or Luftwaffe support divisions. Their involvement in Nazi structures varied widely, yet they were all now stripped of identity, reduced to the same gray uniforms and ration lines. Inside these camps, a cultural collision unfolded. To the American officers and guards, the German women embodied a defeated ideology, but they were also human beings in distress. To the prisoners, the Americans were both captors and moral enigmas, men who had conquered them without hatred. The first acts of kindness came as small surprises: warm food, medical aid, blankets. But the most profound shocks came from freedoms in the subtle, unexpected gestures that undermined everything they had been taught to believe. One such gesture occurred at Camp 222, near Würzburg, a former Wehrmacht logistics site converted into a U.S.-run POW camp. The prisoners, mostly female clerks and nurses from surrendered army hospitals, were confined to an inner compound surrounded by low barbed wire and watchtowers. At first, discipline remained strict. Daily roll calls, head counts, and assigned labor maintained order. Yet as the days passed, the Americans observed that these women posed no security threat. They were exhausted, demoralized, and largely cooperative. They followed orders without complaint, perhaps from habit, perhaps from fear. It was then that a quiet policy shift began. American administrators, influenced by Geneva Convention protocols and psychological observations, recommended easing restrictions. Unlike male POWs who occasionally attempted escape or organized resistance, the female prisoners showed little defiance. Their morale, however, was fragile. Reports noted signs of depression, malnutrition, and psychological disorientation, symptoms worsened by uncertainty and isolation. So the Americans made an experiment. Within the safety of the camp's perimeter, they would allow free movement. The decision was not impulsive. It came after weeks of observation and consultation among the U.S. Army's civil affairs officers, Red Cross inspectors, and medical staff. They reasoned that restoring small freedoms could reduce unrest, improve cooperation, and demonstrate Allied principles of civilized conduct. For many American officers, men who had seen the ruins of Dachau and Buchenwald only weeks earlier, treating prisoners with decency was not weakness but defiance against the very cruelty they had fought to end. When the policy was announced, disbelief rippled through the camp. The women did not understand. Freely? They asked the interpreter. Without guards? Their minds, trained under years of strict military control, could not process the idea of unsupervised autonomy, even within fences. In Nazi Germany, movement had been governed by rank, order, and fear. Now, suddenly, they were told that trust existed, that their captors assumed they would not abuse it. It was a shock far greater than any physical hardship. Over the following days, reports from Camp 222 and similar sites described remarkable behavior. At first, the women remained cautious. They continued to stand in rows, waiting for commands that never came. Slowly, routines began to change. Groups started walking between barracks at will, visiting friends, fetching water, even sitting outside in the afternoon sun. Some used scraps of paper to write letters home under supervision. A few picked wildflowers from the edge of the camp fence, an act unthinkable under the iron discipline of their former lives. The Americans, for their part, watched quietly. They enforced boundaries without aggression, maintaining discipline through presence rather than punishment. To many guards, often young men barely older than the prisoners, the experience was disorienting. The enemy they had fought so fiercely turned out to be women their own age, frightened and polite, sometimes even grateful. The tension of war gave way to an uneasy civility. Behind the scenes, American command saw in these interactions a small but meaningful opportunity. Rebuilding Germany would require more than demolishing its armies. It would require reshaping its mentality. The humane treatment of prisoners, particularly women, was part of that mission. Trust was a weapon as powerful as any rifle, and in those quiet camps it was being tested. For the German women, the shock of freedom became both liberation and humiliation. Many had been raised to believe that discipline and obedience defined worth. Now in captivity, they were learning another lesson, that dignity could exist without authority, and respect could come from those they had been taught to despise. Some could not reconcile the contradiction. They avoided looking at their captors, fearful of their own gratitude. Others, silently, began to question what they had believed. What began as a small administrative decision soon became a psychological turning point, and one that revealed as much about the victor's humanity as the defeated's capacity for transformation. And in the stillness of those camp mornings, As the women walked the narrow dirt paths without escort for the first time, a quiet truth began to emerge, one that would echo through the ruins of post-war Germany. The morning routine in Camp 222 began with the clang of a metal bell and the smell of weak coffee drifting from the mess hall. But something had changed. The same women who once stood in formation, silent and rigid, now moved without command. Their footsteps echoed freely across the gravel paths between the barracks. The wire fences still framed the camp, but inside them, a strange form of liberty existed, controlled, fragile, yet undeniable. For many of these women, it was the first time in years that they could walk where they pleased without awaiting orders or fearing reprimand. The feeling was unsettling. They had lived under a regime where obedience was absolute. From the first day of their service, they had been taught that discipline was virtue, that deviation was betrayal. Every meal, every movement, every word spoken was subject to authority. Now in captivity, their captors refused to control them in the same way. It felt unnatural. Some suspected a psychological test. Others believed it was an attempt to expose their weakness. Yet the Americans never mocked, never threatened. They simply watched and waited. The psychological impact was profound. Freedom in this confined space forced introspection. It demanded thought, something their past roles had discouraged. A German nurse named Greta, who had served at a field hospital in Belgium, later wrote in her diary, "I could not understand why they trusted us. We had been their enemies. I kept thinking there must be a trick, but none came. Only silence and the sound of our own steps." Within the first week of the new policy, subtle transformations began. The tension among the women eased. Their interactions became less formal, their posture less rigid. They began to form small communities, gathering near the laundry area or the makeshift garden beside the barracks. They shared stories, sewed makeshift curtains from old sheets, and exchanged bread for sewing needles. A few even began humming songs quietly, forbidden wartime melodies that once celebrated the Reich, now sung not with pride but nostalgia for a time that no longer existed. The American Guards noticed. Reports filed by officers mentioned a marked decrease in agitation and greater willingness to comply with camp routines. The women, realizing that dignity could coexist with captivity, began to mirror the behavior of their captors, orderly, calm, but individual. The Americans in turn responded with small gestures of respect. When female prisoners carried heavy buckets of water, guards helped without condescension. When a nurse fell ill, she was treated in the same infirmary as captured male soldiers. Such moments, seemingly minor, carried immense symbolic weight. From the American perspective, these policies were not merely acts of mercy. They were strategic, moral diplomacy in microcosm. The U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Division, active in post-war Germany, understood that reshaping the German mind would be key to preventing another rise of militarism. In the words of an internal memo, the demonstration of humanity, when exercised with restraint and consistency, weakens the fanaticism of the defeated more effectively than coercion. The policy of controlled freedom was one such demonstration. It showed that order could exist without fear, a lesson Nazi Germany had never taught. The Red Cross inspectors who visited the camp in June 1945 recorded these scenes with quiet astonishment. One report from Geneva noted, "The women appear to move within the camp with autonomy. They are treated with formality but without hostility." Their astonishment at this treatment remains visible. Photographs taken during these inspections, now stored in the U.S. National Archives, show groups of German women sitting on benches, some writing, others mending clothes. Their expressions are neutral, thoughtful, subdued. There are no smiles, but neither is there defiance. It is the face of a nation awakening from illusion. Among the Americans, reactions varied. Many guards, young men from Kansas, Ohio, and New York, had lost friends in the war. Their initial instinct toward the German prisoners was suspicion or bitterness. But over time, the daily monotony and human contact eroded that hostility. "They weren't monsters," one guard wrote in a letter home. "They looked like school teachers. One of them thanked me when I gave her a piece of bread. I didn't know what to say." In those small interactions, the boundaries of victory and defeat blurred. For the German women, these interactions were equally destabilizing. They had grown up with the image of the enemy as barbaric. propaganda caricatures of Americans as brutal occupiers. Yet here they were, treated not as animals but as individuals. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Some clung to old beliefs, insisting this kindness was temporary or insincere, but others began to question everything they had once believed. If they were what we were told, another prisoner wrote, then why do they feed us better than our own army did? This psychological dissonance marked the beginning of moral rehabilitation. Trust, once broken by ideology, began to reemerge. The American officers encouraged reading sessions and discussions. They distributed confiscated German books, stripped of propaganda. Occasionally, they allowed the women to read English newspapers, hoping to expose them to broader perspectives. A few even began learning basic English words, practicing awkwardly with amused guards. These were small steps, but they represented the slow reconstruction of identity. Yet not all found comfort and freedom. Some women, particularly those with deeper involvement in Nazi organizations, struggled to adapt. They viewed leniency as humiliation, a reversal of power that stripped them not only of authority but of certainty. One former Luftwaffe auxiliary was overheard saying, "They treat us as if we were children. It is worse than punishment." To her, being trusted by an enemy felt like defeat of the soul. It forced her to acknowledge the moral collapse of the ideology she once served. The Americans, aware of this internal conflict, never pressed. Their restraint was calculated. "You cannot force enlightenment," a civil affairs officer remarked. "You can only give space for it to grow." That space and the physical freedom to walk, to breathe without orders, became the quiet classroom in which the lessons of democracy, equality, and humanity were taught. Over the following months, word of this treatment spread among other camps. Reports from newly captured German prisoners often included disbelief. Women are allowed to walk without guards. In contrast to Soviet or French captivity, where stories of brutal retribution circulated, the American approach seemed almost impossible. Some German officers, upon hearing these accounts, accused their female counterparts of lying, but those who later found themselves under American custody confirmed it. The enemy's strength was not cruelty, but discipline anchored in morality. Within Camp 222, that morality took human form in the simplest moments. A young American medic showing a German nurse how to sterilize instruments more efficiently. A guard returning a confiscated photograph of a prisoner's family. The quiet laughter that occasionally broke the stillness when someone mispronounced an English word. These were not political gestures. They were the small fractures in the wall of hate that war had built. The camp became a microcosm of post-war transformation. Every act of trust, however small, challenged the myths of superiority and vengeance that had sustained the Nazi regime. The German women, stripped of propaganda and hierarchy, confronted themselves. Some wept when they realized the scale of what their nation had done. Others simply stared at the horizon, lost in silence. But all understood that something irreversible had occurred. The moral order had shifted. When autumn came, the camp changed again. The routines remained, but the mood had softened. The barbed wire no longer symbolized punishment. It was merely a boundary. Inside it, a fragile community had formed between conquerors and conquered, one based not on fear but on mutual restraint. It was imperfect and temporary, yet deeply human. The freedom that had shocked them at first became ordinary, almost comforting. They no longer looked over their shoulders when walking, no longer hesitated to speak. The Americans had proven something that no lecture could convey, that trust disarms the defeated more completely than any weapon. By the end of that summer, when inspections came again, the Red Cross noted, "The women appear rehabilitated in spirit. There is calm. The environment is disciplined but humane." It was a simple observation, but behind it lay the quiet success of moral warfare, the kind that left no ruins, no dead, only changed minds, and in those changed minds lay the foundation for what was to come. The reconstruction of a nation not through force, but through example. The day that would forever alter the atmosphere of Camp 222 began like any other. Gray sky, thin mist rising from the ground, and the dull rhythm of boots on gravel. Yet something in the air was different. Rumors had spread that morning that high-ranking American officers were coming to inspect the camp personally. The prisoners, still cautious despite months of relative calm, lined up instinctively in front of their barracks. Their coats hung loosely from shoulders thinned by hunger and stress, their hands clasped in front of them in silent apprehension. At precisely 0900 hours, 3 jeeps rolled through the camp gate. An American colonel accompanied by Red Cross representatives and several interpreters stepped out. Their demeanor was firm but not harsh. The women's eyes followed them, alert, suspicious, uncertain. They expected another inspection, perhaps new restrictions. Instead, something unexpected happened. The colonel ordered the internal barbed wire gates within the camp, those separating different sections of the compound, to be removed. Within an hour, soldiers began dismantling the fences that divided the prisoners by rank and role. The sound of metal being pulled from the ground rang out across the camp. The women stood watching, unsure whether to be relieved or frightened. Then an announcement echoed from a loudspeaker, translated into German by the interpreter. All prisoners are permitted to walk freely within the entire camp area during daylight hours. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly a few women stepped forward. Their feet hesitated on the dirt paths where, until that day, guards had patrolled with rifles. Others followed, whispering to each other in disbelief. Some began to cry, not loudly but with small stifled sobs, the kind that come when fear begins to loosen its grip. The Americans observed silently. They had debated this decision for weeks. The war was over, but suspicion lingered. Intelligence reports warned of die-hard Nazi sympathizers attempting to form underground resistance groups, known as werewolves. Yet the officers overseeing the camp had seen enough to know these women were not insurgents. They were weary remnants of a defeated ideology, women who had once served an empire now reduced to ashes. The colonel's intent was both symbolic and strategic. He wanted to test how far trust could go, to see if liberty could reform a mind faster than punishment. And within days the results were visible. The women began to move with a strange mixture of fear and wonder. They lingered near the edges of the camp, touching the wooden posts where the inner fences had stood. Some sat beneath trees sketching or writing. Others ventured into the old barracks that once belonged to the male prisoners, reclaiming spaces long denied to them. To the American guards, it was a quiet miracle. They had expected chaos, fights, escapes, defiance. None of it came. The women respected the boundaries instinctively. They walked freely, but no one tried to flee. There was nowhere to go, and perhaps no will to run anymore. They understood that the world beyond the wire was just as broken as the one inside. Then, something happened that crystallized the transformation. A convoy of supply trucks arrived carrying medical equipment, food, and boxes of notebooks and pencils. The Americans began distributing them to the female prisoners. For personal records, the interpreter explained. You may write letters, diaries, whatever you wish. No censorship. The shock was instantaneous. Under the Nazi regime, diaries had been forbidden in military units for security reasons. Even civilian women had risked punishment for private writing that strayed from propaganda norms. Now their conquerors were handing them the means to express their own thoughts, freely and without fear. That night, candlelight flickered through the cracks of the barracks as dozens of women sat hunched over paper. Some wrote letters to families they had not heard from in months. Others began to record their experiences, the bombings, the marches, the collapse. For many, it was the first time they could articulate what had happened without fear of reprisal. Their words were hesitant at first, shaped by shame and confusion. But as days passed, those pages began to fill with introspection, remorse, and in some cases, the first glimmers of understanding. The camp became eerily quiet in the evenings. The only sound was the soft scratch of pencils. The guards making their rounds noticed the change. It's strange, one wrote in his report. When they started writing, the camp felt less like a prison and more like a hospital. Something healing was happening, not to their bodies, but to their minds. A week later, another change came. The Americans arranged for several German doctors, themselves POWs, to assist in medical operations within the camp hospital. To everyone's surprise, they allowed some of the German female nurses to volunteer as assistants. These were women who only months before had worked under the Nazi medical corps, following rigid hierarchies and ideology-laced procedures. Now they were helping in a hospital, managed by their former enemies. The atmosphere inside the operating tents was tense at first. The nurses, accustomed to strict command, worked in silence. But the American doctors treated them as equals, explaining procedures, asking for instruments politely, sometimes even cracking dry jokes. The shock of professional respect struck deeper than any punishment could. "They called me sister," one nurse recalled years later. "They treated me as a nurse, not as a German, not as a prisoner. It was the first time in my life I felt seen as just a person." Outside, the camp continued to evolve. The freedom policy had spread to other U.S.-run compounds. Camp 222 became something of a model, an experiment in moral rehabilitation. Red Cross observers began referring to it informally as the Camp of Quiet, Dignity. Reports described it as an environment where prisoners respond to humane treatment with discipline and decorum. The result astonished even American officers who had doubted the approach, but not everyone approved. Some Allied personnel considered the leniency dangerous. In their view, these women were not innocent civilians but part of a system that had supported tyranny. Allowing them freedom, even within fences, seemed an insult to those who had suffered under the Reich. Heated arguments broke out in officer meetings. "We cannot build democracy by coddling fascists," one British liaison warned. The American command countered, "We are not coddling. We are teaching." The tension reached its peak one afternoon when a senior officer from another sector arrived unannounced. He toured the camp, observing prisoners walking leisurely, some laughing softly among themselves. His reaction was severe. He demanded to know why security had been relaxed. The American colonel in charge simply replied, "Because fear is the only thing we haven't tried ending." The visitor left without comment. The next morning, the camp's routine continued unchanged. That moment, the refusal to revert to old methods of control, marked the true turning point. It wasn't just about German prisoners anymore. It was about what the victors chose to become after victory. The Americans had faced a moral crossroads, to mirror their enemy's cruelty or to rebuild through compassion. By choosing the latter, they redefined what it meant to win a war. In the weeks that followed, the effects rippled outward. Female POWs who had once cowered at the sight of Allied uniforms now greeted guards politely. Some even volunteered for extra duties, cleaning medical wards or tending gardens near the camp's perimeter. The lines between prisoner and guard blurred into something more human. One Red Cross nurse wrote, "I saw a German woman thank an American soldier for carrying water to her tent." He smiled back. That smile, in its quiet way, was the death of the war. The climax of this transformation came on an ordinary morning when the camp gates opened wider than usual. A convoy of trucks waited outside, not to take prisoners away, but to bring supplies for reconstruction in nearby villages. The colonel called for volunteers. Dozens of women stepped forward without hesitation. They were escorted but not forced to load and distribute supplies in war-torn German towns. Civilians stared as the once feared female soldiers of Hitler handed out blankets and food under American supervision. For the prisoners, it was both humbling and redemptive. For the locals, it was bewildering. When they returned that evening, exhausted but visibly changed, the Americans greeted them not as enemies, but as collaborators in recovery. That day, trust crossed the final threshold. The war's psychological barrier, the one that separated the conqueror from the conquered, had been breached, not by force, but by empathy. By autumn, the experiment was deemed a success. Escape attempts were nearly non-existent. Violence was unheard of. The women, once broken by ideology, had begun to rebuild a sense of self rooted not in obedience but in responsibility. The freedom they had been given inside the fences had prepared them for a greater one beyond them. The moment the inner fences came down was the moment the war truly ended for them. Not on the battlefield, not in surrender, but in the quiet realization that humanity, when extended even to the defeated, could rebuild what bombs had destroyed. The war was over, but for the women of Camp 222, the end of fighting did not mean the end of consequences. The months following Germany's surrender were a slow reckoning, not only for soldiers and officials but for the ordinary people who had served, obeyed, or simply survived within the Nazi system. The women who now walked freely within the camp fences faced a future filled with uncertainty. Would they be tried, released? Rejected by their homeland, few knew. What they did know was that their captors had given them something that their own government had never offered: respect without condition. The American officers, overseeing the camp sent their final reports to the War Department. They noted something remarkable. Disciplinary problems had dropped to almost zero. Cooperation among prisoners was high, and morale, though subdued, was stable. The experiment in moral control through trust, one officer wrote, has proven unexpectedly effective. The U.S. command, still cautious, considered this model for broader implementation in POW and displaced person camps across occupied Germany. But the story of these women was more than an administrative success. It was a quiet transformation, the first sign of how a broken society could begin to rebuild itself through decency rather than domination. Red Cross inspectors returned again that autumn. Their findings were consistent. Prisoners were healthier, more cooperative, and visibly calmer than in previous months. The guards had softened too. Many of them had learned fragments of German, enough to exchange greetings or ask about families. Some even shared cigarettes or small gifts, gestures that blurred the rigid roles of victor and captive. One inspector's diary captured the atmosphere perfectly. It feels no longer like a prison. It feels like a station between two worlds, the one destroyed and the one not yet born. When the first groups of women were informed that they would soon be released, the reactions were mixed. Some cried openly. Others stood silent, unable to process the idea of returning to a country that no longer existed as they knew it. The Reich had vanished. Cities were ruins. The uniforms they once wore with pride were now symbols of shame. Many feared what awaited them beyond the camp's wire, not Allied guns, but the judgment of their own people. "We have no home to go to," one woman said quietly to an interpreter. The American officer in charge could only nod. He understood. The release process began in waves. Each prisoner was registered, photographed, and fingerprinted before departure. They received ration cards, temporary passes, and in some cases, basic supplies: soap, a towel, a few tins of food. As they stepped beyond the camp gates, many turned to look back. It was an odd reversal. They were leaving captivity, yet what they were walking into was a far harsher uncertainty. Inside the camp, they had safety and structure. Outside, there was hunger, rubble, and the heavy silence of defeat. For those who remained, the camp took on a strange serenity. The fences no longer mattered. They had become symbols of protection rather than oppression. In the evenings, women still gathered by the barracks steps, writing in their notebooks by lantern light. The diaries they had been allowed to keep, once a symbol of liberation, had grown into something larger, a record of awakening. In them were reflections on loss, guilt, survival, and the simple shock of kindness from an enemy. Many of those diaries would survive long after the camp itself was dismantled. Historians who later studied these writings found recurring themes: disbelief at the humane treatment received, confusion over moral collapse, and deep introspection about the war's meaning. "We expected hate," one nurse wrote, "but they gave us water and soap. They said nothing of revenge. It made me question everything." Another entry from a communications officer read, "Perhaps this is what they mean by freedom. Not orders, not fear, just choice. I never knew it before." These were not the words of propaganda. They were the private confessions of people confronting their own humanity after years of denial. The American soldiers who had guarded them carried their own lessons home. Many wrote letters describing the transformation they had witnessed. "We fought them because we had to," one wrote to his mother. "But seeing them now, you realize war turns everyone into something they're not. They're not monsters. They were just told lies long enough to believe them." For those soldiers, Camp 222 became a chapter of reconciliation, an unseen front in the battle to reclaim decency after total war. As winter approached, the camp began to empty. The barracks that once held hundreds of prisoners grew silent. By late 1946, most of the women had been processed and released into civilian custody. Some found work with relief agencies or hospitals under Allied supervision. A few, still distrusted, faced interrogation and denazification hearings. Yet many carried with them an understanding that would shape their lives in the years to come. That survival was not just about endurance, but about rediscovering one's own conscience. The Americans, meanwhile, turned their focus to reconstruction. They recognized that these women, educated, disciplined, and now humbled, could play a role in rebuilding the shattered social infrastructure of post-war Germany. Former nurses and clerks were encouraged to join local administrations or medical units. Some were even offered training in public health, nursing, or education by American-run programs. The very people who had once served a regime of control were now being asked to serve a democracy of care. This quiet reintegration became one of the unsung successes of the Allied occupation. By treating even minor participants in the Nazi system with fairness and humanity, the U.S. had sown seeds of reform that punishment alone could never achieve. Moral authority, they understood, came not from vengeance but from consistency, and consistency meant holding fast to principles even when facing those who had violated them. Not all stories ended with redemption. Some women returned to homes where suspicion and bitterness lingered. Former soldiers looked at them with contempt, viewing their capture and treatment by Americans as dishonor. Others faced the judgment of civilians who had suffered under bombing raids or displacement. The shame of association with the Nazi war machine was not easily erased. Many hid their pasts, burning their uniforms and even their diaries. But the memory of that brief, unexpected kindness meant being allowed to walk freely, to write, to think, stayed with them for decades. In the years that followed, as West Germany began to rebuild, those same women became quiet carriers of democratic values. They raised children who would grow up in a different moral landscape, one shaped by both guilt and gratitude. When asked, some would speak of the Americans not as occupiers but as examples, men who had won without cruelty. One former prisoner interviewed in 1963 said, "They showed us what victory without hate looks like. I never forgot that." The camp itself did not survive the new Germany. By 1947, it had been dismantled. The land was returned to local authorities and later used for agricultural storage. Only a small memorial plaque now marks the site where the fences once stood. But the spirit of that place, the strange mixture of defeat and decency, lived on in memory. The story of Camp 222 became one of the quiet moral triumphs of post-war Europe, proof that even in the ashes of destruction, humanity could still find a way to rebuild trust. The official American reports filed to Washington closed the file on the camp with an understated conclusion. Discipline maintained through trust rather than enforcement. Prisoners responded with cooperation and respect. No incidents recorded. It was a bureaucratic summary, but behind those words lay a deeper truth, that the strongest weapon the United States had wielded in victory was not firepower or force, but restraint. When the last group of women was released, the guards lined up by the gate as they always had. The prisoners, carrying their few belongings in bundles, walked past them silently. There were no salutes, no farewells, just mutual acknowledgement. One guard, a young corporal from Michigan, later wrote, "They didn't thank us and we didn't need them to. It was enough to see they were no longer afraid." In that moment, the war truly ended, not in parades or treaties, but in the quiet recognition that mercy, extended at the right time, could heal wounds that punishment never could. Years later, when the world had moved on and Germany had rebuilt itself into a modern democracy, the story of places like Camp 222 rarely appeared in history books. It was overshadowed by the great battles, the politics, the destruction. Yet for those who had lived it, both captors and captives, it remained an unforgettable lesson about the fragile but enduring strength of humanity. The women who once trembled behind wire fences came to understand that their real liberation had not been the lifting of gates but the collapse of fear. In that American-run camp, they discovered a truth their ideology had denied. That dignity was not something granted by power, but something revealed through empathy. They had been stripped of everything, uniforms, status, illusions, and yet, when treated with fairness, they found the courage to look inward. That was how reconciliation began, not with grand speeches, but with small acts of respect between enemies who dared to behave as equals. For the Americans, too, Camp 222 left its mark. It reminded them that victory was not complete until it proved moral superiority, that rebuilding required restraint as much as justice. In the rubble of post-war Europe, where revenge could have ruled, they chose discipline and mercy instead. That choice, quiet and deliberate, became a foundation for the democratic rebirth of Germany, and perhaps for the moral compass of the West itself. When historians later studied those years, they called it the re-education of Germany. But in truth, it was more personal than that. It was about men and women rediscovering what it meant to be human after years of darkness. The war had shown what hatred could destroy. The peace, not in small places like Camp 222, showed what respect could rebuild, and so, long after the fences were gone, the lesson remained, that even in the aftermath of total war, mercy could achieve what force never could. It could end the war inside the human heart.